We're going to be talking about the situation in low and middle income countries 6 months, a little bit more than 6 months since the invasion of Ukraine, which all of you know was the ominous date of the 24th of February. So let me introduce myself. My name is Charlotte Hebebrand. I'm the Director for Communications and Public Affairs here at IFPRI. Our media manager, Drew Sample, will be joining us soon, is a little bit stuck in traffic. And I'd like to welcome all of you online. We have with us Philip Rasher from AgriPulse, Josephine Okoje from Business Day Nigeria, David Lynch and Emily Rahula, both with the Washington Post, Barnabas Tundlana, who's a freelance writer for Reuters, Jerry Hagstrom from the Hagstrom Report, and Anne Finnegan from the Irish Farmers Journal. We will also have several journalists that will be listening to the recording afterwards. And we have in person, very happy to see Steve Baragona here from the Voice of America. So a warm welcome to all of you. Our IFPRI researchers that will be doing this briefing for you this morning, I think probably don't need much introductions. It's David Laborde and Joe Glauber, both of them senior research fellows at IFPRI. In addition, Joe is the former chief economist at USDA. And they will be providing some updated analysis on the global food security considerations and answer your questions about the potential short and longer term impacts of the ongoing crisis. In addition, and I imagine it will be Joe, will also provide an overview of USDA's latest World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates, which are always highly anticipated. This one was just released yesterday, and we'll be talking about what the findings of that report show for food security around the world. And before I hand it over to Joe, who will start the briefing, let me just also briefly mention one other report that is being released today, and that is a mid-year report for the 2022 Global Report on Food Crisis, which is being put together by the Food Security Information Network, of which IFPRI is a member. So it comes out with some very important and timely updates on the number of people that are requiring urgent humanitarian assistance. So their report, again, being released today, indicates that we are forecast to reach up to 205.1 million people in 45 of the 53 countries or territories that are included in the GRFC report, which was published in May. So this is an update on that report. And importantly, out of those 45 countries, the data shows that there was an increase of up to 29.5 million people in need of urgent humanitarian assistance since last year, so quite significant. And also important to mention that the report does include, this mid-year report does include a section on the Ukraine crisis and its impact on food and fertilizer prices. However, the estimates I just gave you, the forecasts, do not, for many of the 45 countries, do not yet capture the compounding impacts of the war in Ukraine. They only did that for 16 countries. In addition, this report has a section on the Horn of Africa, which I think is one of the most dire regions in the world right now in terms of really reaching famine proportions in Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. So with that, let me turn it over to Joe Glauber, who will kick us off on this press briefing. Thanks again, everybody.
Well, thanks, Charlotte. And welcome, everybody attending here and online. Good. Oh, I see my camera's a little shut. Yeah, I got it. So I thought what I would do briefly, David will be joining us in a second, but I would give a kind of a brief overview of where we are right now relative to the last 6 months. I think Ukraine captured so much attention sort of in the food security space, particularly early on, while prices were, we saw them go up 30, 40, 50%. a lot of concern over how well countries were going to be able to, first of all, even get access to food, but then how were they going to be able to pay for it. We also had this emerging issue as well on sanctions and how they might be affecting the fertilizer market, because both Russia and Belarus are major exporters of fertilizer to the world. And so a lot of questions on how that would translate into productivity, poverty, other sorts of issues. What I'm going to kind of deal with in the first few things is just on actually what's been happening in Ukraine and why that continues to be a concern. And of course, the news has been full of great progress on the military front, but on the agricultural front, you still have very serious problems. From the beginning, what we had was this blockade of Ukraine ports. And remember that Ukraine is a major exporter of foodstuffs. Our calculations, when we put things on a caloric basis, about 6% are of what's traded in the world. And particularly if for commodities like wheat, where it's 10%, maize, some 15% or so, sunflower oil, 50%, very major player. And essentially 90% of what they export goes out through those Black Sea ports. So when the war began, and even prior to the actual invasion, about a week before, those ports were blocked. And moreover, insurance companies, other shipping companies just refused to send ships into the area because of an active war going on, obviously. What happened then is that grain and other commodities were forced to find alternative routes. And there was a lot of reports early on about grain moving by rail out to the Danube, down through Romania to some of the ports there, or up through Poland and the Baltic countries. Just remember that adds substantial cost to shipping grain. And so while all that, we did see some grain flow, it wasn't much. And you can see on the chart that really the months following the invasion, we are at very, very low levels, 1 to 2 million tons, when at times Ukraine shipped 6-7 million tons of grains. So, and this is just barley, wheat, and corn. I don't have on here vegetable oil and other foodstuffs that they do ship. It's just to say that was a huge blow, both to the world in terms of getting grain, where normally Ukraine would be shipping a lot of wheat from last year's harvest, corn, other things. They were just unable to get it out. And so what that meant is that storage space, which normally would have been vacated because people would have been getting grain out of storage into ships off to other things, all of a sudden that started backing up. And we're at a point now where, at least in the by early fall, where the fall plant or the spring planted crops are starting to be harvested, and there's very, very little storage space. And of course, what the big news last month was that there was an initiative in the Black Sea, this so-called Black Sea Grain Initiative that was brokered by Turkey and the United Nations between Russia and Ukraine, that's allowed grain and other foodstuffs to move out of 3 of the ports right around Odessa. And that's about 50% of the shipping capacity. And you can see by the chart that, yes, a lot has shipped, about 2 million tons or so of wheat, barley, and corn to a variety of countries. I would say there's been a lot of attention where early on, people were saying, well, gee, this just seems to be going to high-income countries like the EU. Yes, that's true. A lot of corn does go to the EU. A lot of corn goes to China. But these are pretty typical patterns. And remember that a lot of the early trade in August were ships that had already been loaded in February at the time of the invasion and just now are getting out. So it shouldn't surprise us that these trade patterns look very different than what they normally would look like. But the critical thing is these are still low levels, and maybe this I think the world hopes that this will kind of get back to more normal patterns. But remember, at this time of year, they are exporting typically around 6 million tons of grain, and that just isn't happening. They're roughly at around about 30% of that level, and that's going to all that means is that yes, some of the grain is moving out, but we still have very big storage problems. And where that has an impact is the fact that when you can't get storage, when you can't move that grain out, or you have to go by very, very expensive routes to get it out, that means much lower prices within Ukraine. So even though world prices, which have come down a lot over the last couple of months, the fact is that in Ukraine, they still remain quite low. And that could potentially have adverse effects on plantings come this fall, when farmers would typically be planting next year's wheat crop, because they're facing, as David's going to talk in a minute, still very, very high input costs in the form of energy costs and fertilizer costs, but then low prices. Okay, so I'll move quickly to, well, what about the rest of the world? And I think this is a really important thing, is that we, one is that countries have been able to find additional grain. They have been able to make up for the lack of Ukraine in, and to some degree, Russia. Remember, Russia also was affected by this, has been affected by the war itself, in the sense the first 2 months in the war, ships leaving the Black Sea, it was hard to get ships into the Black Sea because of insurance reasons and other factors. Russia has seemed in the last few months to sort of regain a lot of the export volumes that it typically would ship at this time of year, because of the southern Black Sea ports have been open, and the fact that their own policies that they had export taxes on and other things, as the new crop has come in, they have now relaxed those export taxes. So a lot more grain has been flowing. But if you look around the rest of the world, at least in the first 6 months, there's some surprising things. One is that, remember last year in North America, Canada and the US had very poor crop, and that has been reflected in the fact that the first 6 months of this year, they just didn't ship a lot of wheat. That has started to turn around. Canada has an excellent crop. Where you do see a lot of, where you have seen a lot of increase in exports is from the Southern Hemisphere. Both Argentina and Australia had excellent crops. We had Brazil, because of high prices, have been exporting. Brazil isn't typically an exporter. India, there's been a lot of news about India, about putting on export bans and other sorts of things. But remember that India isn't a traditional large wheat exporter, yet the last couple of years they have been. So all that's been good. I think that certainly if you look at the WASDE that came out yesterday, and looking forward for the 22-23 crop, that a lot of countries are going to be making up this deficit. But the critical thing is we'll see in a moment, we're not really rebuilding stocks. If you look at global ending stocks, here calculated as days of use. So this is sort of akin to what's often referred to as stocks to use ratio. It's just put in terms of how many days of crops we have in terms of in storage at the end of the marketing year. And you can see that these things, in some cases, a little bit of improvement over last year. These are projected levels at the end of the marketing year. So, but by the same token, you look at a crop like wheat, it's at the lowest level pretty much since you'd have to go back to 2007-8 when we had very high prices. So this is in fact one of the reasons why we have continued high prices, and that typically when we see periods of low stocks, what we have higher prices, producers tend to plant more. We do see those stocks start to rebuild and prices come down. But what this crisis has done to a degree, and the fact that Ukraine, this war has affected essentially three crops at this point, because it's obviously the crops that were harvested last fall weren't able to get marketed in time. You have the crops that were harvested this summer in the sense of the winter wheat crop also is affected, hasn't been able to get fully marketed. and the fact that low prices probably looks like they may have a very big impact on Ukraine plantings. A report out of the Ministry of Agriculture, I think it was yesterday, was talking about plantings being potentially down 30%. Again, we'll know a lot more over the next couple of months, but that's the real concern, is that next year's crop will be affected too, which would prolong this tight global market situation a bit longer. And then lastly, I just want to mention my colleague who will be up in a moment, David Laborde, has put together an export restriction tracker that I think most of you know about, that and we've looked at these export restrictions during COVID, compared it to what was going on during the really big food price crisis in 2007, 2008. And you can see that you know, we still have a lot of crops affected by export restrictions. The good news is commodities like palm oil. Indonesia had an export restriction on palm oil. Palm oil comprises about 40 to 45%, if I'm not mistaken, of traded vegetable oil in the world. Very, very important. And so when Indonesia put on a ban, that had immediate impacts with prices skyrocketing for palm oil and bringing up the other vegetable oils as well. And we had this serious drought in Brazil last year that affected soybean oil. A lot of things happening in the vegetable oil market, but further exacerbated by these export restrictions. Indonesia has since relaxed that, largely because their own producers were adversely affected and were protesting and other things. And so they dropped the export restrictions. Vegetable oil prices have come down as a result, which is a good thing. But in the meantime, we do have new restrictions. India has put a restriction on wheat flour, not a terribly big thing. They've already shipped a lot of wheat flour this year. They typically ship a lot more wheat than they do flour. And as I say, they aren't large exporters. What's more troubling is the recent announcements on rice. India has a ban on rice. Broken rice, these are, as the name implied, broken kernels of rice. They get shipped. They're primarily used for feed in developed countries, but in developing countries, those countries will consume broken rice. And India has put a ban on it. Again, a small part of their overall rice exports, but India is the world's largest rice exporter. And the other thing that has been talked about is putting on export taxes for rice. And with that, I've gone a long time, but I'm going to turn it over to David Laborde and let him talk about input markets.
Yes, thanks, Joe, for this overview of what's happened on the commodity markets for agricultural products. I'm going to be brief, but give you an idea of what's happened on the input side and why it matters for different reasons. The first one is there is this tradition of saying, you know, that the remedy to high prices is actually high prices, and because farmers will see higher prices, they will have more incentive to plant. But actually what matters for farmers all around the world is profitability. So the comparison between their cost of production and actually the price of their output. So we have seen wheat, maize, and rice, and so on. And as for agricultural commodities, since last year, we have seen a rise of fertilizer prices. During this year, they went a bit up and down depending on the month. And I would just say also, similarly to what you can see on agricultural markets, there is some seasonality on this. So it's very important to not just, you know, see how prices have changed compared to last month. Sometimes it can be misleading. So typically in May, June, you will see a decrease in some of these fertilizer prices because that's not where most of the people are buying it, because they have already acquired typically their inputs for their cropping season in the Northern Hemisphere, for instance. But just to say that prices of fertilizer remain very high for all the type of fertilizer. So not only nitrogenous fertilizer that are directly linked to the natural gas market and to some extent to the coal market. And therefore, here really the tension between Russia and Europe is really shaping this energy market significantly. And also the fact that both the US and Russia and the EU have stopped buying fertilizer to Russia, even if they are not targeted by sanction. De facto, companies and also potentially farmers in this part of the world doesn't want to deal with Russia. They are going to buy their product from other suppliers. So you see, we have a shift in the pattern of demand that are putting pressure on other producers, like people in the Middle East. And therefore, prices are high, and prices are high for all farmers of the world. And we have not seen any major decline. And once again, the supply side of the fertilizer industry is pretty important, because due to, and you follow your news, you know that the price of natural gas is not just very high in Europe, but it's also now rationing. That make that de facto more than 40% of the fertilizer capacity in Europe are not used and basically doesn't produce. So here also you see how this crisis is impacting the fertilizer market, putting upward pressure on fertilizer prices and basically reducing the profitability of farmers around the world, and not triggering, in some cases, this major supply response that we were aiming for. And even in a country in Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, the situation is worse, because actually for most farmers on the output market, so what they sell is not directly linked to this world market. So the price of maize in Kenya, in Malawi, or in Ghana are not following the upward trend that you have seen on the global markets, when they actually import all their fertilizer. And in this case, even if some countries are putting in place some subsidies, there is a part of the increase of fertilizer prices on the world market that go to them. And basically, the ratio between maize price and fertilizer price in Africa has fallen by 50% in many countries in the beginning of the year. So you see how this input market is so important, because it's the next harvest. And if you want basically to rebuild the stocks that Joe has shown in the previous, in some of the slides, it really means that we need to produce more in the coming month in order to not only keep track with the demand, but also start to rebuild inventories, because it's only when we will have higher level of inventories that the markets will feel more secure, and that we will start to see not only a decrease in prices, but also less volatility in prices. And I will just conclude on that. As you see, we are still living in a world where every week there is sometimes good news, but also sometimes bad news, like the flood in Pakistan that are creating and damaging some crops, creating new demand. And right now, because the rice market has a relatively high level of inventories compared to historical level, you know, the fact that Pakistan is going to lose a part of this rice harvest has not led prices to skyrocket, but that contribute to a really decrease the resilience of the system. And I'm going to stop here now to be able to answer to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe and David. Maybe just one brief reference to some other IFPRI research that was done on basically our modelers looked at the impact of higher food, fertilizer, and energy prices on rural poverty. And just building on David's presentation, for many of the African countries in particular, the impact of the fertilizer price increases was demonstrated to have the highest impact on poverty. So I just want to make that research available to all of you. Maybe we can circulate that to you separately. So with that, let me open it up to some questions from any of you, and I'll look to see who's got a hand raised online. Not sure I can see them from here. Can you?
Say the same thing.
I'm not seeing any hands, so if you're trying to raise your, oh, there we go. Okay.
Yes, hello, this is Bartosz Brzezinski. I'm calling from Politico Europe, so the European office of the Politico brand. There are several voices coming, especially from the civil society and NGO, on whether the kind of the crisis, the fertilizer crisis that we're seeing now, whether that could be an impetus for a shift away from chemical fertilizers and towards alternative methods. In Africa, we see that with a project, $1 billion project funded by Gates and Rockefeller Foundations, among others, that promotes the use of chemical fertilizers. We have civil society raising concerns that there are alternative models that should be pushed. So a question to the speakers maybe on whether you think food security can be achieved without chemical fertilizers.
Great, thanks for the question, Bartosz. Let's hand over to David.
So basic answer, no, not with the type of technology we have, and not, I would say, before 2050, when the world as a whole has found a way to really develop, I would say, a circular economy where we can recycle all nutrients. And the basic story is that with the crops that we are taking away from the fields all around the world, but also in Africa every year, we are removing much more nutrients that we bring back without chemical or synthetic fertilizer. And actually, if we have managed to feed the world today with 8 billion people, it's basically at the beginning of the last century, we have managed to create and synthesize this fertilizer, in particular nitrogenous fertilizer, and not just to rely on manure and guano. And that was a big technical innovation 100 years ago. Now, of course, we may need more technical innovation and to be smarter in the way we use the synthetic fertilizer, but we need them. And obviously, if you spend time in Africa and you talk to farmers that doesn't have access to this fertilizer, you understand why they have low productivity, low yield, maintaining poverty, and food insecurity. So the fact that we have high fertilizer prices is a problem. Now, part of the solution is how we can use them more efficiently. And obviously here, there is a very important debate. We also want to not waste them. And for example, applying really basic subsidies to fertilizer, like some developing countries are doing, like in India, leads to major waste of fertilizer with environmental damage and the like. So I'm not saying that, oh, you just bring fertilizer everywhere and it's going to be an happy place. No, there is actually bad policies related to fertilizer. There is bad practices related to fertilizer, but we need the synthetic fertilizer to grow the biomass we need to feed the world. Now, this has to be used in complementarity with also important practices to have high soil health. So all the discussion we can have about agroforestry, regenerative agriculture is part of the solution, but they have to go hand in hand with the synthetic fertilizer. And it's clearly not one or the other, or you know, very expensive fertilizer is a good news. No, it's a very bad news for farmer and food security. And we should not sell dream to people, but really be realistic about how you grow crops today.
Maybe if I can add just two things to that. I think the discussion around organic fertilizers is an interesting one, right? Because of course, organic fertilizers do provide nutrients, but it's important to keep in mind that they cannot provide nutrients in the same concentrated fashion that what you're referring to as chemical, or some people simply call mineral fertilizers. So for the moment, it really would not be possible to only rely on organic fertilizers. In addition to that, in a lot of countries, there simply are no organic fertilizers because people are removing cover crops for other reasons. So I think anybody who argues this is an opportunity to go fully organic, that's not going to be a great approach to this. Having said that, there is room for great innovation. How can we make organic fertilizers more rich in nutrients? And there is also work being done on organo-mineral fertilizers, where you're actually combining the two. There's also important work being done on green ammonia, and that if we can make that commercially viable, and actually that may become a reality if gas prices stay as high as they are, that is essentially producing ammonia, which is the key feedstock for nitrogen, from renewable energy through electrolysis. If that can be done, and there is also a project in Africa, by the way, on green ammonia, that would be, I think, a real groundbreaking development if that can be scaled up in a large way. Let's take a question. I think I saw Jerry, you had a question in the chat maybe, but I I'm afraid I can't quite read it from here.
Yeah, I'll read out Jerry's question from the chat. What should this is from Jerry Hagstrom of the Hagstrom Report. What should the current situation mean for planning for next year for institutions like the World Food Program? Where will they get the foodstuffs they have gotten from Ukraine in the past?
Yeah, let me start with that. David may want to add something. I think, Jerry, that is the certainly from the World Food Program. This is a scenario they have seen many times in the past, and certainly 2008, 2010, 11. Anytime when prices are extremely high, it's just not a question of yes, Ukraine has been an important source for World Food Program over the last couple of years. They can find alternative sources. That's not the issue. The real issue is the price that they have to pay. And I think that clearly, when you're talking about humanitarian aid, you want to reduce as many costs as you can. So you want the World Food Program and others to be able to source from the cheapest available sources to get it to the areas that need it the most in the most effective way. And there are several national programs that have food aid. I look at the U.S. program, which has it tied up with a U.S. requirements to float to ship on U.S. maritime ships and other things. Those are unfortunately more costly ways to do it. But I think the importance of providing for governments to be providing assistance to organizations like World Food Program just are so important at these period because of just the costs of just doing normal business. And again, we're talking about not just helping the countries that are normally big recipients. Now we have new demands for like Ukraine and other places where we're need to get improve food availability.
Do you want to say something about humanitarian exemption for WFP?
Yeah, no, a good thing, as you probably well aware, is one of the outcomes of the WTO ministerial was for many years, countries have argued that at least World Food Program should be exempted from any export restrictions. That is, countries shouldn't be restricting export of commodities that are being procured by World Food Program. In the WTO, the ministerial countries pledged to take on that agreement. So hopefully that will be less of a issue going forward. But yeah, it's a very positive development. But the fact is, they need money to be able to buy grain and to be able to ship grain and other important foodstuffs.
Yes, if I can follow up on this, the WFP itself, is honestly a small drop in terms of size of food demand in global markets. So most countries of the world still manage to find grains, WFP will still manage to do it. As Joe has said, there is a question of prices, and so that's an important one. Obviously, for wheat, the price of wheat went down in the last few months compared to the peak in March, April. So that's kind of good news for WFP. Still, that's much more expensive than a couple of years ago. So we still need more money. But also this year, we have a boost in the demand side. So WFP has to increase its activity due to the very severe drought and famine situation we have in the Horn of Africa, the conflict in Ethiopia, now the situation in Pakistan. So that's what put pressure really on WFP more than purely the question of availability. Now, I think that one of the pending questions for WFP and in terms of logistics, when you have to replace shipments from Ukraine, one of the potential alternative country is Russia. And that's where you are going to see some countries that may not be happy to give money to WFP to buy grains from Russia. Obviously, I think that one of the solutions will be WFP to buy some of the semi-processed products like flour from Turkey, and Turkey will buy the grain from Russia. So at the end, trade will continue to flow. But that's the kind of challenge, because actually Russia this year on the wheat market is one of the main countries that can supply more than last year due to very good crops. And that's where you see how the reality of the markets and some diplomatic aspect can interact.
Great. I see hands up. I think this is the right order from Bill, Ann, and then Dylan. So go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, hi. I think you were expecting my colleague Phil, but you got me instead, so I apologize for the letdown there.
Oh,
But Dr. Glauber, I guess this question is mainly for you. You know, everybody's talking about the 3 Odessa ports that are now open, and you rightly said that you know it's still just a fraction of what Ukraine can normally ship from. But how solid is that Black Sea agreement that's allowing all this grain to go out? I mean, should we be concerned that this could well be temporary, especially as you know, conflict heats up there?
yeah, no, Bill, you're absolutely right. It's always been tenuous. If you remember that, the agreement had been inked for about 3 hours when rockets hit nearby in Odessa, and so this has been fraught with tension all the way through. Russia has been critical of the agreement recently because they, remember the chart that I showed, that some of the grain that was being exported was going out to the EU and other high-income countries, and you know, Putin, in fact, is in Turkey this week to talk about the one of the items that will be talked about is the grain agreement. There have been other reports that senior officials within Russia have said that there's no need to extend the agreement beyond the couple months that had been it originally had been established for. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and you have an active war going on, and a war that is escalating right now because of these offensive that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. So yes, very tenuous. Let's hope that it continues. Let's hope that grain coming out of those southern ports actually increases and gets back towards more normal levels. But I think those are all hopes at this point. And right now, it's a situation that's very, very tense and very uneasy.
Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Ann, do you want to jump in with your question?
Yes, good afternoon. It's Anne Finnegan here from the Irish Farmers Journal. 2 questions for the panel, please. And the first one is similar to Bartos's question earlier. In the medium term, when you look at the trajectory of EU policy, specifically the farm to fork, the ambition to have 25% of agri land farmed organically by 2030, and also some of, you know, I suppose our climate change emissions plans, so very much centered around territorial targets, like here in Ireland, that will actually, if we're to achieve them, see a reduction in production, you know, more so than the immediate term. Into the medium term, do you see that as a challenge in terms of world food supply? And accepting that I'm asking the question from Ireland, which is largely a producer of livestock proteins. And then my second question just is relating to fertilizer for the growing season ahead. Obviously, a lot of countries, net importers, are grappling with how to purchase fertilizer, and certainly even in a country in Ireland, there's an ask from our exporters for government intervention. I suppose, first of all, what are your thoughts on that? And secondly, how might that interfere with the market?
So yes, obviously the situation on the world market is putting some pressure on the EU policy of farm to fork, but more generally on the Green Deal, both raising some opportunities and some challenges. And what we see on the food market is actually also mirror about what's happened, you know, on the energy market. And on one hand, you will see people saying, oh, that's a good news, because now we have to learn to get out of the natural gas coming from Russia. But if on the short run, it's meaning producing more electricity with coal, obviously the environmental targets are not reached. And to some extent in agriculture, we have seen the same debate with on the spot, of course, a very ambitious farm to fork agenda that try to make European agriculture greener, and on which the organic pillar, for example, is pretty important. But we have to be careful, organic and green is not synonymous. There's important subtleties to keep in mind there. But one of the response to the crisis was in Europe to see farm lobbies saying, oh, we need to put more land in cultivation, for instance. So instead of keeping land that we have protected, on which we have restored carbon stock and also some biodiversity, the first response was, let's get rid of them and produce more, even if actually the amount of grains or seed we can get from this piece of land will be pretty low, because in many cases, the piece of land you put in this set-aside program are marginal land to start with. So you can see this contradiction. Now, for the future, I don't think that the current crisis is going to shatter the foundation on which this new trajectory of the common agricultural policy is built on, and obviously also the target of decarbonizing the European economy and the food system in the economy is going to stay. Now, what will be the balance in terms of how much food is produced within the border of the EU around this question of food sovereignty discussion that will come back. But also the question is, do we consider that Ukraine is going to remain a reliable supplier? And actually, do we want to help Ukraine rebuild its economy and its farm sector after the war by buying more agricultural products to Ukraine, or saying, no, the east part is too risky and we don't want to depend on this? But you see, there is both economic choice, but also geopolitical one, because you cannot at the same time say, we want to support Ukraine and we are not going to buy the agricultural products. So, where we produce is a question, but also, as you say, how we produce it. And we should not be here also too naive about the organic farming aspect, because organic farming still leads to lower yields than traditional farming. Of course, you can mitigate this, but if it was giving you same productivity, farmers will all shift to organic farming because they get a better price for their output. They will have to spend less on their input and they will get the same productivity. No, if they don't do it, it's because it leads to lower productivity. So now if more organic production in Europe means lower productivity, Europe will have two choices: or reduce basically its food consumption. And what it means mainly is to reduce livestock consumption, to reduce the demand of feed. And that's all the debate, about how much meat or dairy product is consumed in Europe. But that's a decision that at the end, consumer will have to do. Or we are going to, in Europe, import more agricultural product. And basically, the land that we need to produce the food will have to come from somewhere else. And you can put more deforestation pressure in Latin America, in Africa. So there is important trade-off. And what is important for the European stakeholders is really to understand this trade-off. There is no free lunch. There is no miracle solution. And the question is which option the society is ready to make to adapt to some extent to the new situation, where even in Europe this year, you have very severe droughts that are reducing, obviously, the wheat production in France. The situation in northern Italy is also very serious. So the idea of, Europe can stay and all the food that European consume can be done in Europe is not even credible, because climate change is here and the food supply will still to be impacted. Now, to move quickly on the fertilizer aspect, yes, European farmers today are suffering from high fertilizer prices. We have seen some European countries be able to deploy some basically subsidies, like Poland, to protect some of their farmers. You can see a similar situation in Ireland, but also when you see what fertilizer are used for Ireland, it's a lot also to get higher yield in pasture land. So it's also lead basically to the livestock sectors. And if we at one point we want basically market prices to reflect both the fact that fertilizer are not so great for the environment, but also that producing meat products that require either pasture land or grains are actually should be more expensive in order for consumer to adjust. We don't want to interact with that. But obviously, you know, it's not like if farmers in Europe are a very wealthy part of the society. So they will have to be protected in a way by policymakers. Now, subsidizing just fertilizer is not the way forward because it's just, you know, reinforcing bad practices. And I would say if Europe doesn't reduce its demand for fertilizer this year, it means that other parts of the world will have to do. And what we don't want is basically subsidize fertilizer in Europe that will actually compete on the world market with other producers, but also including African fertilizer buyer, and creating this type of wrong competition we want. Maybe I will move to Joe that want to say something about how the US in particular are looking at this situation on fertilizer prices.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, clearly their high input costs are a concern, and even with the most recent farm income numbers, which showed very strong income this last year in the US, at least sectoral income. People point to the fact that input prices are so high, and I would agree totally with David that I think we have to be careful here, because I think the market will take care of itself over time, again with increased mineral production where that's available, as natural gas prices come down, other sorts of things. But I think the last thing you want to do is subsidize that, particularly for you know, developed country farmers that where they are seeing very, very high prices, at least that they're partially compensated for those higher input, or more than compensated for those higher input costs, at least right now.
Maybe I could just make one comment on that, Anne. I remember, I think Ireland used to have a fertilizer industry and decided to end that industry. And Irish farmers have always complained since then about the price of fertilizers. So I can only imagine what it's like now. And recently, the Fertilizers Europe, the association in Europe, indicated that with the rise in natural gas prices in Europe, they estimate that natural gas now makes up about 90%. Usually it's 70% of ammonia production. So clearly there's a big problem, but I would completely agree that subsidies are not the way to go, in particular because farmers in Europe are still benefiting from a higher price as well. So their overall you know, output to input price ratio is much more favorable than in poorer countries. So I think Dylan is next.
Hello, Dylan Cresswell calling in from African Business magazine in London. I'd like to pick up on a point that Monsieur Laborde made about sub-Saharan African countries particularly suffering from the impacts of higher input costs with relation to fertilizers on the basis of there not being any domestic production taking place in Africa. The foundations have been laid for domestic fertilizer production in Africa over the last few years. So a lot of phosphate mining takes place, especially in Morocco, and the natural gas resources are there for increased production of ammonia. And we saw Aliko Dangote in Nigeria set up one of the continent's largest ever fertilizer production plants earlier this year. So my question to the panel is that as we look forward, bearing in mind Africa's vulnerability to global supply chains during this crisis and moving forward, would the best way for Africa to rectify its problems with vulnerability to input costs to be to improve international cooperation and improve transparency in those supply chains, or to focus on a continental specific agenda, perhaps through the new African Continental Free Trade Area, which allows Africa to become self-sufficient in its fertilizer production?
That's a great question.
So I can start. So let's start by saying that, you know, Africa is more than 55 countries. They are very diverse, and they are not all, they don't, of course, they share the same continent. But if you're in Morocco or if you're in Madagascar, your natural trade partners may not be on the continent. I mean, Morocco will still have Europe next door, when Madagascar, to some extent, is facing India and the Gulf countries. So we should not just having a narrative that say, oh, Africa should trade with Africa just because they are on the same continent. You know, geography matters. And therefore, we can see different patterns. And that's why, for example, in Nigeria, it still makes sense for people in Nigeria to export their fertilizer to Brazil, that are a big market ready to pay next door. And it will still be, in many cases, cheaper to export fertilizer from Nigeria to Brazil than from Nigeria to Ethiopia, for instance, just due to infrastructure and geography. Of course, we can improve the connectivity of Africa, and that will be key in the coming year, also to make the Africa Continental Free Trade Area a reality. But I would say we should not force feed an artificial agenda. Now, what is sure is there is phosphate, in particular in Northern Africa, from Morocco to Tunisia, that can be combined with nitrogenous fertilizer made from natural gas, also produced in Ethiopia, in Algeria, in Nigeria, tomorrow in other parts of Africa. So we want to get basically Africa to take opportunity of the resources that exist and can be processed locally and distributed locally. But I mean, not only in Nigeria, we need to see other of this production taking place. Africa, we still have a deficit in potash because the main potash mines in Africa are in Eritrea, and they will not cover the whole need of the continent when actually, product like plantain, banana need potash. So still mean that Africa will need to be connected to the rest of the world to get all the nutrients they need. But obviously there is a lot of opportunity. I think it's great to see how Africa in the recent years were able to process, in particular, the natural gas into nitrogenous fertilizer. But personally, I will also be pleased to see if we have a large initiative on green ammonia, as Charlotte was referring to, meaning that where you kind of start to produce ammonia in a decarbonized way. So you just need water and electricity made from renewable, sun and wind. And that, I think, big opportunities for Africa, because it means that also African countries that today doesn't have natural gas or doesn't want to go crazy on fossil fuel can also develop their own fertilizer industry in a much more decentralized way, in a much more inclusive way, because let's be honest, today, one of the major barriers of penetration of fertilizer in Africa is still distribution cost, transportation cost, that's very expensive. And so the more you can have local production, but you see in the sense that make way using technology that allow to get this more decentralized production and give access to a local source of fertilizer in an efficient way is what we want to do. And if at the same time that can contribute to the climate agenda of the continent and basically not just paste and copy of the mistakes of other parts of the world, that will be important.
We just get back to that really, without even talking about nitrogen, you could be just as, or fertilizers, you could be talking about food as well. I think that what David's saying, the things like transportation infrastructure, that the cost of moving grain or any foodstuff or fertilizer or anything from the coastal countries inland, there's just very, very high costs. And we've done some work at IFPRI monitoring those costs, looking at informal trade, looking at other things. But that really is the key. I mean, we talk about a continental free trade agreement. I think that is really important. It'd be great to bring down some of those tariffs. Those external tariffs are actually quite high. But the real, I think the real key is reducing those transactions costs in terms of moving grain, from inland markets to export markets and vice versa, to increase intra-regional trade.
And just to maybe finish on this point, that we're also in this crisis, we are talking about food prices, we are talking about fertilizer prices, but we also know that fuel prices are pretty high. And that's where many, African farmers are already suffering from that, because transportation cost in Africa is directly linked to fuel prices. Everything goes from motorcycle to trucks, but it's not like, even you have a very strong railroad systems. So everything is linked to fuel and diesel and gasoline. And currently these prices have more than doubled. So it means that the connection of farmers to cities to get their inputs or to sell their outputs have been really hurt by this, meaning that they have to reduce their selling price to still access to the urban centers, and they have to pay more to bring any input they need. And so, this investment in infrastructure and making sure that these trading costs go down between countries and within countries is key to address the structural weaknesses that Africa is facing today. And so at the end, the sadness for the continent is not the fact that they are too integrated with the rest of the world, including themselves, but not enough integrated.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I don't see any more hands up unless somebody's got a last question they want to ask. If not, let me really thank very much Joe and David for their presentations and answering your questions. And many thanks to all of you for joining. And then last but not least, I'd like to invite Drew Sample to the podium. Many of you know Drew. He has been IFPRI's media manager for quite a number of years and is sadly leaving IFPRI. So I just want to thank him for all the great service that he has provided to IFPRI, and you'll be much missed, Drew.
Thanks, Charlotte. I didn't prepare any speech for this, so I'll just also say thank you to everyone on the call. It's been great working with all of you. Many of you I've been working with for a few years now, and I do hope that we will stay in touch in my future endeavors as well. So thanks.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's bad.
And do get in touch with me in the meantime. We will get a new media manager, but I'm very happy to be in touch with all of you, know some of you, and look forward very much to working with you. And don't hesitate to come back if you have any questions about anything that was presented today or any further research done by IFPRI. Have a great rest of your day from wherever you're calling in from.